and it is usually men who are seen out there on the streets, in the Taziye processions, during the month of Muharram. The Shias sort of commemorate really the world over that sacrifice made at Karbala, where the brothers both were they were killed for their beliefs and for what they stood for by the tyrant Yazid. And it's the women generally are observers. They have their own spaces where they express mourning and they beat on their chest, but that is not a spectacle. So in some ways, male sacrifice to me seems to be
more of a spectacle.
More of a spectacle than an internal thing. And that made me think about, when we talk, particularly the discourse around war is often sold to us as, we are sacrificing our young men primarily, although women have entered the armed forces, particularly in the West, in Western countries, certainly in the US, but it's really a male spectacle of violence, of war directed outward, and the sacrifices that men make, but then, by actually going out there and putting their lives in the line of fire for their motherland usually. And so the motherland, interestingly, is the figure of the woman and the mother, and the background of Karbala also. You have the sisters Zainab singing about the brothers. And so the women's role is always about singing about or otherwise commemorating the sons and the lovers and the husbands who have gone off and lost their war. So their role is much more passive and more of the sort of visible mourning, but not necessarily of actually loss of life per se.
But Dr. Saba, it seems to me that there is one level that you've described. Then there is almost a pre-feminist moment of feminism that we see in Sufi poets. And there I think the recognition of this feminine voice becomes very important, because most of the Sufi poets speak in the voice of a female.
Correct.
Right? And I think that Ranja Ranja Kardini me appe Ranja hoi, Akho ni manu dido Ranja, heer na akhe koi. All right? So that's written by a male Sufi poet who takes on that persona and that voice. Let's talk about that voice. Why do you think Sufi poets felt that the feminine voice was more appropriate to a more committed form of love?
I mean, I think that for me as a woman, that's obvious. I'm glad that we had Sufi male poets who thought that way as well. But I think precisely because the feminine one is that part of what we have learned to call or name as the feminine, is that part of humanity which is associated traditionally with love, with compassion, with our urge towards peace and tolerance and getting on and getting on with each other. And I think that the Sufi poets that I know, whose work has inspired me also and inspired other activists in Pakistan whose work I have studied and with whom I've worked with closely on theater and on other aspects of performance. And they too have been drawn to Sufi poetry and the poetry of Baba Ghulam Farid and Baba Bulle Shah and others of their ilk, because these people are elaborating a vision of a tolerant, compassionate, pluralist society and ethos. And I think they couldn't have done that without drawing on that, what we call the feminine principle. And I think the mistake that patriarchy has made is to engender these visions or versions of human beings which radically oppose the masculinist or male on the one side and the feminine or the female on the other, as though they are completely separate spheres, very different. And so men brought up by and large under that kind of ideology tend to want to excise the feminine from their own personas, their personalities, their value system, and so on. And I think that kind of excision and distancing of the feminine from the masculine has led us really to, it's a simple or perhaps even simplistic way of putting it, but at some level I believe this very deeply, that that is precisely why we are at this juncture.
Wouldn't you say that in Punjabi Sufi poetry, the feminine principle is twice reinforced. First, by taking on the female persona, and then reaching back to the mother.
Yeah.
माए नी मैं किन्नू
माए नी
आखा
किन्नू
दर्द
आखा।
छड़े दा हाल
Yeah.
लिखी लौ कलम दी माए मोड़ जे सकनी है मोड़. So how do we see this double reinforcement? Not only the poet itself takes on the persona of a female, but goes back to mother, another female.
Because I think there is this yearning for the comfort and the security and those moments of peace that a mother's lap brings forth in the male imaginary. And certainly in the West too, people, psychoanalysts, psychoanalytic theorists like Jacques Lacan, who has then later been also, revised and taken, his work has been taken further by many renowned feminist theorists like Siksu or Irigaray, Julia Kristeva. And they have all talked about this pre-patriarchal, what they call the pre-imaginary of the male, that state of being that the child knows before entering into the language of the law, which is the language of the father, which excises the feminine principle. And it is that area where our desires are not necessarily vocalized, verbalized, but they are linked to the maternal body. It is that longing that I think our Sufi poets knew and understood much before Jacques Lacan came along and wrote about that.
Well, of course, don't we need to say that Jacques Lacan's critique is more appropriate and more valid for the West, less so for the East. And if you go next door to India, for instance, look at their whole pantheon of gods and goddesses.
Correct.
There the picture becomes far more complex, and Western model perhaps is not readily applicable.
I think to some degree, you are quite correct. But to some degree, I think that we also see very extreme forms of patriarchy in the East, in those societies which have, at the same time that they have this, kind of poetry and certainly in India, where in the religion and the form of the philosophy of Hinduism, all the goddesses that you're talking about, that unfortunately patriarchy has taken root there in ways.
In Sati, for instance.
In Sati, for instance, absolutely. So
Yeah.
and then we see with the advent of a particular version of, in contemporary times, we would say that the Deobandi school of Islam, which is linked to, sort of a Wahhabist interpretation of Islam that takes us away from Sufi versions, those kinds of patriarchal beliefs and models have not just disappeared, and they are in fact reinforced by these other models of religious belief in that region. And those models follow very much very similar trajectory to Western patriarchy. I don't think they are so different, and to that degree, I think the work of people like Lacan, the other French feminists that I mentioned, are in fact quite useful. And I mean, I think that also in terms of Sufi poetry, that while at the one hand I think it's fabulous and wonderful that their work celebrates the divine in the form of something that we might call a feminine principle that we see in their references to the mother and the beloved and so on, that at some level they also unfortunately reinforce, I think, a particular vision of the woman that is then just circumscribed by the role of the mother and the beloved. So they have their own limitations.
All right, we'll continue with that discussion. We are going to listen to a little more music, and then we'll take a short break. After break, we'll come back and talk about these patterns and to what extent they limit or liberate the female principle in all of us. Stay tuned with us.